What makes a boy of 12 pick up a brick and smash it into a stranger's face for the price of a pint of ale? Is it hunger? Is it the soot-choked air of a city that manufactures everything but hope? Or is it something older, something darker, coiled in the human heart? We think we know the story. We've seen the razor blades stitched into the brims of their flat caps, a glint of steel in the gaslight, a swift, terrible slash. But that, like so much of this tale, is a lie. A brilliant, seductive lie, but a lie nonetheless. The truth begins here, not with a razor, but with a boot. A heavy, steel-toed boot, swinging in a wild arc, connecting with a man's jaw with the sound of cracking bone. This is Birmingham, England, in the late 1800s. And the Peaky Blinders are not yet a legend. They are a nightmare made of flesh and blood, younger and far more brutal than you could ever imagine. In this city, forged in the fires of the Industrial Revolution, the smoke from the factory chimneys was thicker than morality, and the steel in your pocket was valued far more than the soul in your chest. The streets were a labyrinth of black brick and despair, a place where life was cheap and violence was the only currency that never lost its value. This wasn't London, with its grand theatres and political machinations. This was the dark heart of England's industrial engine, a city called the workshop of the world. But for the thousands crammed into its back-to-back slums, it was a prison without walls. Entire families lived in single, damp rooms, breathing air thick with coal dust and the metallic tang of the foundries. The sky was a permanent shroud of grey smoke, pierced only by the angry orange glow of the furnaces that never slept. Children, some as young as 6 or 7, worked 12-hour days in deafening factories, their small hands perfect for clearing jams in machinery that could tear a limb off in a second. Life expectancy was brutally short, disease was rampant, and the only escape, for most men, was the pub. Gin was cheaper than bread, and a drunken stupor was the closest thing to peace many would ever know. It was out of this toxic soup of poverty, pollution, and desperation that the gangs emerged. They were not a new phenomenon. They were an inevitable one. They called themselves Slogging Gang, and their business was pure, unadulterated violence. These were not criminal masterminds plotting elaborate heists. They were territorial animals. Young men and boys, with no future and nothing to lose, fighting over a few squalid streets as if they were kingdoms. Their wars were not about profit, they were about status, about pride, about the raw, visceral thrill of dominance in a life that otherwise offered none. The weapon of choice was not the elegant firearm of a gentleman gangster. It was the belt buckle, heavy brass buckles wrapped around the fist to create a makeshift set of brass knuckles capable of splitting a man's scalp to the bone. They used knives, of course, and bricks, stones, and their heavy work boots, shod with iron or steel tips. A slogging was a beating, a stomping, a brutal, frenzied assault delivered by a mob. To be slogged was to be beaten senseless, often for no reason other than being on the wrong street at the wrong time. This was the world that created the Peaky Blinders. They weren't the first, and they weren't even the biggest. They were just one of many packs of wolves preying on the weak in a city that had forgotten what mercy looked like. The name itself is a subject of endless debate. The popular myth, the one that sells television shows and tweed caps, tells us it came from the razor blades they sewed into the peaks of their caps, used to slash at an enemy's eyes, blinding them. It's a terrifying cinematic image. It is also, almost certainly, complete fiction. Disposable safety razor blades were not widely available until the early 1900s, years after the original gang had risen and fallen. The more likely and far less glamorous explanation lies in the slang of the time. A peaky was a popular term for a flat cap with a prominent peak. To blind was street slang for a particularly sharp, dapper appearance. These were not just thugs, they were peacocks of the slums. They dressed to impress, to stand out from the grimy masses. So a Peaky Blinder was likely just a name for a young man who wore a peaked cap and had a certain swagger. The name was less a statement of purpose and more a brand, a label for a particular style of street hoodlum. The violence came with the territory, not the name. The first recorded mention of the Peaky Blinders as a distinct entity appears around 1890, and the crimes that brought them to the attention of the law were shockingly pathetic. On March 23, 1890, a man named George Eastwood was drinking in the Rainbow Pub in Adderley Street. He made the mistake of ordering a non-alcoholic ginger beer. This was seen as an insult by a group of local toughs. They followed him outside, they cornered him, they beat him so severely he was hospitalized for 3 weeks with a fractured skull. The attackers were members of what the local press called the Small Heath Peaky Blinders. This wasn't a bank robbery, it wasn't a turf war, it was a savage beating over a soft drink. This was the reality of their power. It was petty, vicious, and utterly without reason. These were not men building a criminal empire, they were boys lashing out at a world that had given them nothing. They were driven by boredom, cheap alcohol, and a desperate need to feel powerful, if only for a fleeting, violent moment. Their victims were ordinary people, factory workers walking home with their meager wages, shopkeepers, anyone who looked like an easy target. A typical Peaky Blinder crime involved a group of 4 or 5 gang members surrounding a lone individual. They would start with insults, then shoves, then the first punch would land, and the pack would descend. Kicks from steel-toed boots, blows from fists and belt buckles, until the victim was unconscious. Then they would rifle through his pockets for a few coins, a watch if they were lucky, and melt back into the labyrinthine streets of Small Heath or Bordersley. The police, understaffed and often intimidated, could do little. Witnesses were too afraid to talk. The gang's power was built on a foundation of terror. Not the strategic terror of a crime syndicate, but the raw, unpredictable terror of a rabid dog. You never knew when or why it might bite. It was this randomness that made them so feared by the common folk of Birmingham. The composition of the gang was fluid. There was no formal hierarchy, no made men. It was a loose association of neighborhood youths bound by a shared geography of poverty and a penchant for violence. Some of the earliest individuals identified by police as Peaky Blinders are a shocking testament to the reality of the gang. Harry Fowles, known as Baby-Faced Harry, was arrested in 1904 for bike theft. He was just 19, but others were even younger. David Taylor was arrested at the age of 13 for carrying a loaded firearm. These were not seasoned criminals, they were children. Children who had learned early that in the slums of Birmingham, the fist was mightier than the law. Their courtroom appearances were a grim spectacle. Small, underfed boys in oversized coats staring blankly as a magistrate read out a list of brutal assaults. They showed no remorse. Why would they? Remorse was a luxury for those who had something to lose. They had nothing. In a world built of iron and steam, the human spirit was just another raw material to be hammered into shape. The city was a machine, and its people were the fuel. But sometimes the fuel ignited. The Peaky Blinders were one such fire, a dirty, uncontrolled blaze that fed on the desperation around it. They offered a twisted kind of glamour to boys with no other prospects. To be a blinder was to be feared, it was to have a name. It was to wear a smart suit, a silk scarf and a stylish cap, a uniform that declared you were not just another cog in the industrial machine. You were something different, something more dangerous. This appeal, this dark charisma, was their most potent weapon. It ensured a steady supply of new recruits, eager to trade a lifetime of grinding poverty for a few short, violent years of notoriety on the cobblestone stage of Birmingham's streets. Their story isn't a romance, it's a cautionary tale written in blood and grime. The question that echoes down the century is not how they became so powerful, but why a society would create conditions where such savagery was the most attractive option available. Was it the system that failed these boys, or was their brutality a choice born of an inherent darkness? What do you think fueled their rage more, the hunger in their bellies or the hate in their hearts? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Their distinctive style was more than just a uniform, it was a declaration of war against the drabness of their existence. While their neighbours wore the shapeless, grimy work clothes of the factories and foundries, the Peaky Blinders adopted an almost aristocratic look, filtered through the lens of the slum. The signature flat cap, or peaky, was pulled low over one eye, an affectation that radiated menace and concealed identity. They wore bell-bottom trousers, tailored to be wide and flapping around the ankle. Their jackets were often tight-fitting, with large brass buttons polished to a high shine. But the most important element was the silk scarf, or neckerchief, knotted brightly at the throat. It was a splash of vibrant colour in a monochrome world, a deliberate provocation. And their boots, always heavy leather boots, often with steel tips, polished until they gleamed even in the dim gaslight. This wasn't just fashion, it was psychological armor. It projected an image of success and defiance. It told the world they were not victims of their circumstances, they were masters of their small, violent patch of it. This carefully crafted image was central to their identity and their terror, separating them from the common man and marking them as predators. The real faces behind this facade, however, were not the calculating anti-heroes of fiction, but petty thugs whose police records tell a much grimmer and far more pathetic story. The men who comprised the core of the gang were not criminal geniuses. They were simply the most vicious. Police records from the late 1890s and early 1900s paint a clear picture. Let's meet some of the real Peaky Blinders. There was Harry Fowles, arrested at 19 for stealing a bicycle. He wasn't plotting to take over the city's bookmaking operations, he was a common thief. There was Ernest Bales, also in his late teens, pulled in for assault after knocking a man unconscious for his pocket watch. Then there was Thomas Gilbert, whose police mugshot has become iconic. With his dark eyes and sharp suit, he looks the part. But his crime was not some grand scheme, it was deserting the army. These were the so-called kings of the Birmingham underworld. Their rap sheets are a litany of petty theft, drunken brawls and street robbery. The gang's most notorious member, and arguably its most dangerous, was a man named Stephen McHickey. He was a brute, a career criminal whose life was a revolving door of street fights and prison cells. Yet even his reign was one of street-level thuggery, not organized crime. Let's dissect their signature crime, the street robbery. It was a simple but effective formula. A lone man, preferably one who looked like he'd just collected his weekly wages, would be targeted. The attack was never a one-on-one affair. That wasn't their style. It was always a pack. 3, 4, sometimes as many as 10 blinders would emerge from a dark alley or a pub doorway. The first move was often a distraction. A woman, a moll, might ask for the time. As the victim looked at his watch, the first blow would come from behind, a brick to the back of the head, a heavy belt buckle across the face. Before he could even register what was happening, the rest of the pack would be on him, a whirlwind of fists and boots. They were merciless. They would continue kicking and stomping their victim long after he was subdued. The goal wasn't just to take his money, it was to inflict maximum damage, to leave a message. They'd take whatever he had, a few shillings, his boots, even his coat, and then vanish as quickly as they appeared, leaving him broken and bleeding on the cobblestones. In a city of shadows, they were the masters of the ambush. The police blotters of the era are filled with these stories. A man named William Armitage was set upon by 3 blinders on Lichfield Street. They beat him with their belts until he was unconscious, all for the sum of 4 shillings and 6pence. Another man, a labourer named George Davis, was attacked on his way home from work. They fractured his skull and left him for dead in a gutter. He survived, but he couldn't identify his attackers. They had come from the shadows and returned to them. This was their domain. They were creatures of the night, their bravado fueled by cheap liquor and the safety of numbers. The idea of a Peaky Blinder engaging in a fair fight was laughable. Their entire philosophy was based on overwhelming force against a defenseless target. They were bullies, plain and simple, albeit exceptionally well-dressed ones. The myth paints them as rebels against a corrupt system. The reality shows them as predators feasting on their own impoverished community. The people they robbed and brutalized were not the rich elite. They were their own neighbors, fellow workers, trapped in the same hopeless cycle. Their dandified appearance served a dual purpose. On the one hand, it was a badge of honor, a symbol of their criminal success. It showed they had money for tailored clothes and silk scarves when others were struggling to afford food. This elevated their status among the desperate youth of the slums and attracted new members. On the other hand, it made them easily identifiable to the police. The Birmingham constabulary knew exactly who they were looking for. The sight of a group of young men in bell-bottoms and peaked caps was an immediate red flag. This bravado, this need to be seen, was also their undoing. Unlike a true criminal organization that operates in the shadows, the Peaky Blinders craved the spotlight. They wanted to be known, to be feared. This arrogance led to frequent arrests, and the court records provide a treasure trove of information about their activities. Their trials were often public spectacles, with gang members showing up to support their arrested comrades, sneering at the police and intimidating witnesses. Consider the case of the aforementioned David Taylor, arrested at 13, charged with unlawfully and maliciously wounding. He and his friends had gotten into a drunken argument with another group and settled it with bricks and knives. In court, he stood small and defiant, a child wearing the hardened mask of a veteran street fighter. The magistrate, likely seeing dozens of boys like him every week, sentenced him to a month in prison. This was the justice system's revolving door. A short stint inside was not a deterrent. It was a rite of passage. It gave a young blinder credibility. He would return to the streets a hero with stories of his time inside, his status within the gang elevated. Prison did not reform them, it hardened them. It was a training ground, a place to network with other criminals and learn new tricks. In the brutal calculus of the slums, a prison sentence was simply the cost of doing business. For these boys, a criminal record was the only resume they would ever have. Their reign of terror was geographically limited. The Peaky Blinders were a product of specific neighborhoods, Small Heath, Bordersley, and the surrounding industrial wastelands. Their power did not extend across Birmingham, let alone the entire country. They were a local problem, a particularly nasty one, but a local one nonetheless. Their world was a claustrophobic one, consisting of a few dozen streets, a handful of pubs, and the local police court. To imagine them as a national crime syndicate is to misunderstand the very nature of their existence. They were parochial. Their ambitions were small, to control their corner, to be the toughest gang on their street, to have enough money for beer and a new suit. The grand criminal strategy depicted in fiction was utterly alien to them. Their planning rarely extended beyond the next robbery, the next brawl. They were impulsive, emotional, and driven by the primal urges of youth, pride, lust, and a bottomless well of directionless rage. They were a symptom of a sick society, a brutal expression of the social ills of Victorian England. To romanticize them is to ignore the squalor and misery that created them. It is to spit on the graves of their countless anonymous victims, the men they beat senseless, the families they terrorized. These are the forgotten characters in the Peaky Blinders story. We remember the swagger and the style, but we forget the cost. We forget the fear of walking home at night, the sound of footsteps behind you, the sudden explosion of violence in a dark alley. The real story of the Peaky Blinders is not a gangster epic, it's a tragedy. A story of wasted lives, of boys who chose the path of the wolf because they were raised in a world that saw them as nothing more than sheep for the slaughter. They chose to be predators rather than prey. Their violence was a language, the only one they knew how to speak fluently. And the message was simple: we exist, we are here, and you will fear us. This fear was their crown, and the cobblestones of Birmingham were their bloody kingdom, a kingdom they would soon have to defend against rivals who were just as hungry and even more savage. The streets of Birmingham were a patchwork of fiercely defended territories. Every neighborhood had its own slogging gang, and the borders between them were drawn in blood. For the Peaky Blinders of Small Heath, their greatest and most hated rivals were a gang from the east side of the city, a brutal mob known as the Cheapside Sloggers. The name alone was a promise of violence. Cheapside was one of the most deprived and dangerous areas of Birmingham, and its gang reflected the character of their turf. They were rougher, less concerned with fashion, and utterly merciless. While the Blinders cultivated an image of criminal elegance, the Sloggers were pure, unadorned muscle. They were the sledgehammers to the Blinders' supposed rapiers. The rivalry between these two gangs was not a matter of business or strategy. It was a matter of tribal hatred, a feud that would explode into some of the most spectacular and bloody street battles the city had ever seen. These were not back-alley skirmishes, these were full-scale riots, wars fought on the cobblestones. These pitched battles, often referred to as local derbies of violence, could involve hundreds of people. They were prearranged, almost ritualistic affairs. Word would spread through the pubs and factories. The Blinders were meeting the Sloggers on Saturday night at the intersection of two streets, a piece of no man's land between their territories. As the appointed time drew near, the streets would clear of ordinary citizens. Shopkeepers would shutter their windows. Families would lock their doors. A tense silence would fall over the neighborhood, the prelude to a storm. Then they would arrive. Gang members, their supporters and thrill-seekers drawn to the promise of bloodshed. They came armed not with guns, which were rare and expensive, but with the tools of their trade. Belt buckles wrapped around fists, heavy boots, knives, bricks, cobblestones pried from the street, and specially weighted kosh sticks. This was medieval warfare played out in a modern industrial city. The fighting was chaotic and savage. There were no battle lines, no tactics beyond a full-throated charge. The two gangs would crash into each other with a roar, a heaving mass of bodies, swinging, stabbing and stomping. It was a maelstrom of violence. The goal was to break the other side, to make them run. Individual duels would break out within the larger melee, men squaring off, circling each other before descending into a flurry of blows. The air would be filled with the shouts of the combatants, the screams of the wounded, and the sickening thud of iron on bone. These were not quick fights. They could rage for an hour or more, a running battle that surged up and down the streets, leaving a trail of broken bodies in its wake. The police, when they dared to intervene, were often hopelessly outnumbered. A dozen constables armed with wooden truncheons were no match for 200 enraged gangsters armed with knives and bricks. Often, the best they could do was to form a cordon and try to contain the violence, picking up the stragglers and the badly injured after the main fighting had subsided. One of the most infamous of these battles took place on a Saturday night in 1898. The confrontation was sparked by a minor dispute in a pub, an argument over a girl or a spilled drink. Within hours, the call to arms had gone out. Nearly 300 men, a mix of Blinders and Sloggers, converged on St. Bartholomew's Square. For nearly 2 hours they fought a brutal, shifting war across the square and into the surrounding streets. Residents watched in terror from behind their curtains as men were knocked to the ground and mercilessly stomped by the opposing side. When the police finally managed to restore order, the square looked like a battlefield. The cobblestones were slick with blood. Dozens of men were injured, many seriously, with broken bones, stab wounds, and severe head trauma. One young man, a slogger named George Williams, was found dead, his skull caved in by a brick. His death was barely noted in the papers, just another casualty in a war that had no end and no purpose. These wars were not about expanding criminal enterprises. They were about bragging rights. They were about which gang could claim to be the cock of the walk. The violence was an end in itself, a spectacular performance of masculinity and tribal loyalty. For the young men involved, these battles were the defining moments of their lives. They were a chance to prove their courage, to earn the respect of their peers, to feel alive in a world that was slowly killing them with monotony and toil. The scars they carried were not marks of shame, they were medals of honor. They spoke of the Great Battle of Digbeth or the rout on Bordesley Street with the same reverence a soldier might speak of a famous military victory. This was their war, their only war, and they fought it with a passion and ferocity that was terrifying to behold. It was a deeply personal, almost intimate form of violence, face to face with your enemy, looking him in the eye as you brought a weapon down on his head. The rivalry between the Blinders and the Sloggers defined the landscape of street crime in Birmingham for nearly a decade. It created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear in the neighborhoods they controlled. You had to watch what you said, where you drank, who you associated with. Crossing an invisible line from one gang's territory to another could get you killed. The police fought a losing battle against this tide of violence. They would conduct raids, make arrests, and secure convictions. But for every gangster they sent to prison, 2 more seemed to rise up to take his place. The system was creating them faster than the law could lock them away. The slogging gangs were not an aberration. They were a core feature of life in the industrial slums. They were a brutal, self-policing society operating in parallel to the official one, with their own codes, their own loyalties, and their own savage form of justice. This era of chaotic, territorial warfare, however, was destined to be short-lived. The world was changing. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it new ideas, new technologies, and a new kind of criminal. The slogging gangs, with their primitive methods and pointless wars, were dinosaurs. Their brand of violence was passionate but unprofitable. They fought for pride, not for pounds. As the new century began, a more sophisticated, more organized, and far more dangerous form of crime was beginning to take root. These new criminals saw violence not as a recreational activity, but as a tool of business. They were not interested in street corners, they were interested in empires. The days of the mass brawl were numbered. A new power was rising, one that would sweep away the petty kings of the cobblestones. The Peaky Blinders and the Cheapside Sloggers were about to discover that there was always a bigger fish, a more ruthless predator. A man was coming to Birmingham who would change the rules of the game forever. His name was Billy Kimber. Billy Kimber was a different breed of criminal. He wasn't born in the slums of Birmingham. He was a Birmingham native, but he had learned his trade on the racetracks of England, a world far removed from the petty squabbles of the slogging gangs. Racetracks were where the real money was, and where there was money, there was organized crime. Kimber was smart, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He had charisma, a sharp mind for business, and a talent for organization. He saw the slogging gangs for what they were, amateurs. Their violence was loud, messy, and ultimately pointless. Kimber understood that real power didn't come from being the toughest man on the street. It came from controlling the flow of money. He built a formidable organization known as the Birmingham Boys or the Birmingham Boys. They were not a territorial street gang, they were a mobile army of thugs who traveled the country, dominating the racetracks through intimidation and violence. The business of the Birmingham Boys was protection rackets and bookmaking. At every race meeting, they would extort money from the legitimate bookmakers, demanding a fee for protection. Any bookie who refused to pay would find his stand smashed to pieces and his clerks beaten senseless. Kimber's men were disciplined and professional. They didn't get into drunken brawls over trivial insults. They used violence surgically to achieve a specific business objective. They were armed not just with knives and bricks, but increasingly with firearms. A pistol was a far more effective tool of intimidation than a belt buckle. Billy Kimber had connections. He forged alliances with powerful gangs in London and other major cities, creating a national network of crime. He was a gangster for a new era, a businessman whose commodity was fear. When he turned his attention to his home city of Birmingham, the old slogging gangs like the Peaky Blinders didn't stand a chance. The clash between the old and new guards was inevitable. The Peaky Blinders and their rivals were still fighting over street corners, while Kimber was thinking in terms of national territories. The Blinders' income came from robbing drunken workers of a few shillings. Kimber's gang was pulling in thousands of pounds from the racetracks. It was a mismatch on every level. The Peaky Blinders were a relic, a throwback to a more primitive form of crime. Their methods were outdated, their ambitions pathetically small. When Kimber's Birmingham boys began to assert their dominance in the city, the slogging gangs were faced with a simple choice: get in line or get wiped out. Some of the tougher, smarter members of the old gangs were absorbed into Kimber's organization. They were offered a chance to make real money, to be part of a professional outfit. For many, it was an easy decision. Why fight for scraps in the gutter when you could have a seat at the table? Those who resisted were systematically dismantled. Kimber's men didn't engage in mass brawls. They were more efficient than that. They would isolate a rival gang's leader, corner him with overwhelming numbers, and administer a beating so severe it would serve as a warning to all the others. They took over the pubs that served as gang headquarters. They used their financial muscle to bribe police and gather intelligence. The Peaky Blinders, who had ruled through brute force and intimidation, found themselves outforced and out-intimidated. Their reputation on the streets meant nothing to these new arrivals. The Birmingham boys were fighting for profit, not pride, which made them far more dangerous. They had no emotional investment in the old rivalries. They were simply clearing the board of irrelevant players. The era of the slogging gang was over. The age of organized crime had begun. By the 1910s, the name Peaky Blinder had already started to lose its specific meaning. It was becoming a generic term used by the press and the public to describe any young street thug with a bad attitude and a sharp suit. The original gang had faded, its members jailed, dead, or absorbed into the new criminal landscape. Billy Kimber was the undisputed king of the Birmingham underworld. His influence extended far beyond the city, making him one of the most powerful gangsters in all of England. The story of his eventual downfall, his legendary clashes with the London gangs, is a chapter in British crime history all its own. But for our story, his rise marks the definitive end of the road for the original Peaky Blinders. They were a product of the 19th century, and they could not survive in the 20th. They were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outthought. The world was moving on, and the brutal but simple ways of the slogging gangs were being replaced by a colder, more calculated form of criminality. The romance of the street fight was replaced by the cold logic of the balance sheet. This transition marks a crucial turning point. The street gangs were a social problem, a symptom of poverty and despair. The organized crime syndicates that replaced them were a business, a dark mirror of the legitimate capitalism that surrounded them. They didn't just want to terrorize a neighborhood, they wanted to own it, to monetize it. The Peaky Blinders were ultimately just a bloody footnote in this larger story, a violent spasm that was quickly suppressed by a more powerful and disciplined force. Their legend would far outgrow their actual influence, but their time as a genuine power on the streets of Birmingham was remarkably short. They burned brightly, violently, and then they were gone, extinguished by the arrival of a true criminal professional. Faced with this evolution of evil, one has to wonder, who is truly more dangerous to society? The passionate, chaotic street thug who kills for pride, or the cold, calculating businessman who uses violence as just another tool for profit? Was it better to fall to the predictable brute or the calculating boss? Drop your choice in the comments. A new kind of lawman would soon arrive to fight this new kind of criminal, but he would find the city's soul already deeply scarred. While Billy Kimber was changing the criminal landscape from within, another powerful force was about to change it from without. The Birmingham City Police Force for much of the late 19th century had been fighting a losing battle against the slogging gangs. They were underfunded, undertrained, and often outmatched. The constables on the beat were tough men, but they were tasked with policing a city on the brink of social collapse. Corruption was a problem, and public trust in the police was low. The gangs operated with a sense of impunity, believing, often correctly, that they were beyond the law's effective reach. All of that was about to change with the arrival of one man from across the Irish Sea. In 1899, the city of Birmingham appointed a new chief constable. His name was Charles Horton Rafter, and he was about to declare a war on the gangs from which they would never recover. Rafter was not a native of Birmingham. He was an Irishman, a former officer in the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force that had the unenviable task of keeping order in a deeply divided and often violent Ireland. He had learned his trade in a place where policing was akin to counterinsurgency. He was tough, incorruptible, and a brilliant administrator. He arrived in Birmingham with a clear mandate to clean up the city and break the power of the gangs. He was appalled by what he found, a police force that was reactive, not proactive, a city where entire neighborhoods were effectively no-go zones for the law after dark. He immediately set about implementing a series of radical reforms designed to turn the Birmingham police into a modern, professional fighting force. He believed that the only way to defeat the gangs was to meet their violence with overwhelming, state-sanctioned force. His first move was to change the physical profile of the police force. He instituted a minimum height requirement of 5 feet 10 inches and in some cases 6 feet, ensuring his constables were big, physically imposing men who could handle themselves in a fight. He recruited heavily from among former soldiers and men from rural areas, believing they were tougher and less susceptible to the corrupting influences of the city. He armed them with heavier, longer truncheons and trained them in crowd control and street fighting techniques. Rafter's new police force was designed to intimidate. He wanted the gangs to fear the sight of a policeman's uniform. He put more officers on the beat, instituting a policy of zero tolerance for public disorder. Loitering on street corners, public drunkenness, any behavior that hinted at gang activity was met with an immediate and forceful police response. The days of the police being outnumbered and outfought were over. Rafter also understood the importance of intelligence. He established a network of informants within the criminal underworld, paying for information that led to arrests. He created a system of detailed record-keeping, building files on known gang members, their associates, their habits, and their territories. For the first time, the police were not just reacting to crimes, they were actively mapping and targeting the criminal organizations themselves. He waged a relentless campaign in the courts and the press, demanding harsher sentences for gang-related violence. He argued that a short prison sentence was not a deterrent but a badge of honor, and he pushed magistrates to impose longer terms of penal servitude. The goal was not just to arrest the gang members, but to take them off the streets for good. The results were dramatic. Arrest rates for violent crimes soared, conviction rates followed. The Peaky Blinders and other slogging gangs suddenly found themselves under constant, relentless pressure. The battle for control of the streets was fierce. Rafter's new police did not shy away from violence. When faced with a gang, they would charge in with truncheons swinging, a disciplined unit breaking apart a disorganized mob. There were numerous accounts of brutal clashes between the police and the gangs, but now the police were winning. They conducted massive, coordinated raids on the pubs and back alleys that served as gang strongholds, arresting dozens of men at a time. The gangs, used to fighting among themselves, were unprepared for a war with a well-organized, highly motivated, and legally empowered enemy. Charles Rafter was, in essence, the leader of the biggest, toughest, and only legally sanctioned gang in the city. His constables were his soldiers, and their territory was the entire city of Birmingham. The effect on the Peaky Blinders was devastating. Their leaders were targeted, arrested, and imprisoned. Their members were harassed and arrested for even minor infractions. The streets that had once been their playground became a hunting ground, with them as the prey. The bravado and swagger that had defined them began to evaporate. It was one thing to be the toughest thug on a street of unarmed civilians. It was another thing entirely to face a line of 6-foot-tall policemen advancing with batons drawn. The balance of power on the streets of Birmingham had fundamentally shifted. The state was taking back control. Rafter's methods were harsh, and by modern standards, they would be considered brutal. But they were effective. By the mid-1900s, the power of the great slogging gangs had been broken. Sporadic violence still occurred, but the era of mass street battles and brazen gang dominance was over. The combination of pressure from above, in the form of Charles Rafter's police force, and pressure from below, from the rise of organized criminals like Billy Kimber, squeezed the life out of the old-style gangs. They were caught between a rock and a hard place. They were too primitive to compete with the new organized crime, and too disorganized to resist the systematic campaign being waged against them by the law. The Peaky Blinders were a phenomenon of a specific time and place, the chaotic, under-policed industrial city of the late Victorian era. When that environment changed, they could not adapt. They were like apex predators whose ecosystem had been irrevocably altered. Their extinction was only a matter of time. Charles Horton Rafter's tenure as chief constable is remembered as the period when law and order were finally imposed on the wild streets of Birmingham. He was a man with an iron will, a crusader who saw the gangs not as a social issue to be managed, but as an evil to be eradicated. And for all intents and purposes, he succeeded. But even his formidable will could not have foreseen the global cataclysm that was just over the horizon, an event that would deliver the final, definitive blow to the world of the old, slogging gangs. The Great War changed everything. In August of 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, the petty rivalries and street corner empires of Birmingham's gangs were rendered instantly and irrevocably obsolete. A wave of patriotic fervor swept the nation, and the industrial cities became the engine rooms of the war effort. The factories that had once produced bicycles and brass fittings now churned out munitions, artillery shells, and rifles. For the young men of the slums, the war offered something their lives had never provided: a steady wage, a sense of purpose, and a socially acceptable outlet for their aggression. Thousands of them, including many former and current members of gangs like the Peaky Blinders, flocked to the recruitment offices. They traded their flat caps and silk scarves for the khaki uniform of the British Army. The man who was once your sworn enemy on the streets of Bordesley was now your brother-in-arms in the trenches of Flanders. This is perhaps the most significant point of divergence between the historical reality and the popular television myth. In the fictionalized version, the war is a crucible that forges the main characters into hardened, calculating soldiers, providing them with the skills and psychological trauma that they then use to build their criminal empire back home. The reality was far more brutal and far less romantic. The First World War was not a training ground. It was a meat grinder. The life expectancy of a junior officer on the Western Front could be measured in weeks. For the common soldier, the chances of being killed or maimed were terrifyingly high. The street fighting skills honed in Birmingham were useless against machine guns, artillery, and poison gas. The raw, undisciplined aggression of a slogging gang member was no match for the industrialized slaughter of modern warfare. Many of the former gangsters who went to war simply never came back. They were buried in the mud of the Somme or Passchendaele, their names etched on the countless memorials to the missing. For them, there was no post-war criminal career. There was only an anonymous death in a foreign field. Those who did survive were often changed men, and not for the better. They returned physically and mentally shattered. Men who had witnessed unimaginable horrors were not interested in resuming petty street fights over a few shillings. The scale of their experience had dwarfed the world they left behind. The concept of shell shock, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, was poorly understood, and thousands of veterans were left to deal with their demons alone. They were broken men, haunted by what they had seen and done. The fire of their youthful aggression had been extinguished by the horrors of the trenches. The social fabric of Birmingham itself was transformed by the war. With so many men away at the front, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in the munitions factories and on the trams. This brought about a profound shift in social dynamics and family structures. The war effort also brought a new level of government control and surveillance into daily life. The city was a vital part of the war machine, and public order was a matter of national security. The kind of widespread gang violence that had plagued the city a decade earlier would not have been tolerated. The combination of mass enlistment, a transformed society, and a heightened state of security effectively delivered the final nail in the coffin of the old, slogging gangs. They were a phenomenon that belonged to a bygone era of peace, however squalid that peace may have been. The war wiped the slate clean. When the war ended in 1918, the world the soldiers returned to was a different place. The old certainties were gone. The old gangs were a distant memory. New criminal enterprises arose in the post-war years, dealing in black market goods, illegal betting, and stolen property. But these were more sophisticated operations, run by a new generation of criminals. The age of the Peaky Blinders was well and truly over. They had been rendered extinct by a combination of organized crime, effective policing, and, finally, a global conflict that consumed the very generation that had made up their ranks. They did not evolve, they did not expand, they simply vanished, swallowed by history. Their name, however, would prove to be far more resilient than the gang itself. It lingered in the collective memory of the city, a ghost story told to frightened children, a byword for the bad old days. The actual gang was dead, but the idea of them was just beginning its long, strange journey from local nuisance to global icon. The real tragedy is that the war provided a legal channel for the very qualities that had made them outcasts. The aggression, the tribal loyalty, the willingness to inflict violence, these were celebrated traits in a soldier. The same young man who would have been jailed for assault in 1913 was given a medal for it in 1916. It's a bitter irony. The society that had condemned them suddenly needed them. It sent them to fight and die for a king and country that had offered them nothing but poverty and contempt. They were the disposable youth of a brutal empire, first brutalizing each other in the slums, then sent to a far greater slaughterhouse across the sea. The myth tells a story of empowerment. The history tells a story of exploitation and erasure. The Great War was not the making of the Peaky Blinders, it was their unmarked grave. The men who might have carried the name into the 1920s were lying in the fields of France, their violent lives ending not with a bang, but with the whimpering exhaustion of a generation fed into the maw of an indifferent war machine. The myth of the Peaky Blinders is a testament to our profound desire for romantic anti-heroes. We want to believe in the sharp-suited gangster with a moral code, the noble outlaw fighting a corrupt system. We prefer the complex, tortured soul of a fictional character to the grim reality of a violent, uneducated street thug. The story of the gang's transformation from a historical footnote into a cultural phenomenon is in many ways more fascinating than the story of the gang itself. It is a case study in how myth is made, how a dirty truth can be laundered into a glamorous lie. For decades after their disappearance, the name Peaky Blinder was simply a local colloquialism in Birmingham, a generic term for any sort of ruffian or gang member, much like hooligan or hoodlum. The specific history of the original late Victorian gang was largely forgotten, preserved only in dusty police archives and brittle newspaper clippings. The first step in their resurrection came from historians. Academics and local history enthusiasts began to comb through the archives, piecing together the story of Birmingham's industrial past. Philip Goodison's book, The Gangs of Birmingham, was a key text, collecting the scattered accounts of the slogging gangs and presenting them as a coherent social phenomenon. But this was academic work, read by a niche audience. The legend as we know it today was born from a different source entirely. It began, as many modern myths do, with a story passed down through a family. The creator of the television series, Stephen Knight, has spoken of how his father's uncles, the Sheldons, were illegal bookmakers in the 1920s and were, in his family's law, Peaky Blinders. This personal connection, this childhood memory of impeccably dressed, powerful men, became the seed of the fictional narrative. The name was evocative, the look was stylish, and the setting was rich with dramatic potential. The raw materials for a great story were all there. The television series that premiered in 2013 took these raw materials and built a fictional universe around them. It took the name of a 19th-century street gang and applied it to a fictional family of Irish Romani gangsters operating in the 1920s. It took the signature style, the cap, the suit, and elevated it to the level of high fashion. And most importantly, it took the myth of the razor blade in the cap, a detail long debunked by historians, and made it the central bloody emblem of the gang. The series creators were not making a documentary, they were crafting a gangster epic in the tradition of The Godfather or Goodfellas. They needed complex characters, high-stakes plots, and a sense of operatic tragedy. The historical reality of petty thieves and street brawlers was simply not good enough. So, history was rewritten. The timeline was shifted, the characters were invented, and the scale of their ambition was magnified 1,000 times over. What made the myth so potent? Why did this particular version of the story capture the global imagination? Part of it is the aesthetic. The show created a powerful and instantly recognizable look, the tailored tweed, the heavy boots, the iconic cap. It aestheticized the poverty and grit of industrial Birmingham, turning the grim backdrop of smokestacks and canals into a gothic, almost beautiful landscape. It tapped into a modern nostalgia for a past that never existed, a time when men were supposedly real men, bound by codes of honor and loyalty. The characters were portrayed as flawed, but ultimately sympathetic anti-heroes, family men fighting for their place in a hostile world. They were violent, yes, but their violence was often directed at people who were even worse than they were. This moral ambiguity is the key to the modern anti-hero. It allows the audience to root for the bad guy without feeling too guilty about it. We crave stories about rebellion, about individuals who defy the system and live by their own rules. The fictional Peaky Blinders are the ultimate embodiment of this fantasy. This process of myth-making is not unique to the Peaky Blinders. We see it with outlaws of the American West like Jesse James or Billy the Kid. They were, in reality, ruthless killers and thieves, but in legend, they become folk heroes, symbols of freedom and resistance against the encroaching forces of law and capitalism. We are drawn to these figures because they represent a freedom that most of us will never experience. They operate outside the constraints of society, a fantasy that is deeply appealing in our highly regulated bureaucratic world. The problem, of course, is that the myth completely erases the victims. It erases the terror felt by the ordinary people who had the misfortune of crossing paths with these violent men. It turns a social tragedy into a fashion statement. The flat cap, once a symbol of working-class life and later of gang aggression, is now a trendy accessory sold in high street stores. The name that once caused people to lock their doors is now branded on pubs, barbershops, and bottles of whiskey. A story of brutal poverty has become a lucrative commercial enterprise. The monster has been tamed, packaged, and sold back to us as a hero. What does it say about our culture that we so readily consume these sanitized versions of violent histories? Are we drawn to the style of rebellion, or do we truly admire the substance of their defiance? Tell us your take in the comments. The journey from reality to myth is a one-way street. Once the legend takes hold, the truth becomes a footnote, an inconvenient detail for spoilsports and academics. But the truth is still there, buried in the archives, waiting for anyone who cares to look. And what those archives show is a story devoid of glamour, a stark and brutal portrait of life and crime at the bottom of the social ladder. To truly understand the Peaky Blinders, we must leave the realm of fiction and enter the world of the police ledger and the courtroom docket. We must look at the evidence. The surviving records from the Birmingham police and courts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are the closest we can get to the real gang, and they tell a consistent and frankly pathetic story. There are no master plans, no political intrigues, no epic love stories. There is only a monotonous cycle of petty crime, senseless violence, and short prison sentences. Let's examine the primary sources. The police mugshots are perhaps the most powerful artifacts. These are the real faces of the Peaky Blinders. They stare out at us across the century, their expressions ranging from sullen defiance to outright fear. There is Harry Fowles, with his boyish face that earned him the nickname Baby-Faced Harry. There is Stephen McKickey, his face already weathered and hardened by a life of violence. And there is Thomas Gilbert, looking dapper in his suit, but with a hunted look in his eyes. What is most striking about these photographs is how young they are. These are not grizzled, middle-aged crime lords. They are boys, teenagers and men in their early 20s, dressed in their Sunday best for their appointment with the police photographer. Their crimes, meticulously recorded in the charge sheets, are a world away from the high-stakes drama of the television series. A typical entry in a police ledger from 1899 reads, Thomas Richards, age 21, labourer, charged with drunkenness and assault on a constable, sentenced to 14 days hard labour. Or, John Moore, age 19, no occupation, charged with theft of a pair of boots, sentenced to 1 month in prison. This is the reality of their criminal careers: drunken brawls, shoplifting, street robbery that might yield a few coins. Their sentences were correspondingly minor: a few weeks, a few months. The idea of a Peaky Blinder being important enough to warrant a long sentence of penal servitude was rare. They were considered a public nuisance, a persistent problem, but not a threat to the foundations of the state. The court transcripts, when they survive, reveal uneducated young men, often barely literate, struggling to explain away their actions. Their defenses were simple: they were drunk, it was a misunderstanding, the other fellow started it. There is no evidence of the sharp wit or cunning intellect attributed to their fictional counterparts. The newspaper reports of the time also paint a clear picture. The local Birmingham press frequently reported on the activities of the slogging gangs, but they were treated as a social menace, not as a sophisticated criminal organization. Headlines screamed of street ruffianism and hooligan outrages. The articles described chaotic brawls, cowardly attacks on individuals, and the general terror they inspired in their own neighborhoods. The name Peaky Blinder appears, but it is often used interchangeably with other gang names or as a general descriptor for a well-dressed young thug. There is no mention of a single, unified gang with a charismatic leader. Instead, the reports speak of bands of Peaky Blinders, suggesting multiple, independent groups who adopted the same style and name. This completely undermines the idea of a single, family-based criminal enterprise. The most damning evidence against the myth is the complete absence of the Peaky Blinders from any national records. They do not appear in the files of Scotland Yard in London. They are not mentioned in parliamentary debates about crime. They were, in the grand scheme of things, a purely local phenomenon. Their fame, such as it was, did not extend beyond the borders of Birmingham and the surrounding Black Country. To find them, you have to dig into local municipal archives, the records of a city struggling with the social consequences of rapid industrialization. The picture that emerges is not one of criminal masterminds, but of lost boys. They were the products of a system that offered them no education, no opportunities, and no hope. Their violence was a cry of rage against a world that saw them as disposable. It was brutal, it was ugly, and it was ultimately futile. The archives do not offer us heroes. They offer us a tragedy, written in the dry, bureaucratic language of the law. The ink may be faded, but the truth it tells is stark. The real Peaky Blinders were not kings. They were just casualties. The fiction, however, needed a bigger stage. A local story about street thugs beating each other with belts was not enough. To create a true epic, the gang's influence had to be expanded, their enemies made more formidable, their ambitions inflated to a national scale. This is where the narrative of the series departs most radically from historical fact, venturing into the realm of pure fantasy. The show weaves a complex tapestry of political intrigue and gangland warfare, placing its fictional heroes in direct conflict with some of the biggest players of the era: the IRA, Winston Churchill, and the powerful Jewish and Italian gangs of London. It's magnificent drama. It is also complete and utter nonsense. There is not a single shred of historical evidence to suggest that the real Peaky Blinders ever had any dealings with these groups or individuals. Let's start with the London connection. The series portrays the Peaky Blinders launching a full-scale invasion of London, taking on the established criminal empires of the city. In reality, the Birmingham gangs were strictly small-time players compared to the London underworld. The capital's criminal scene was far older, larger, and more sophisticated. Gangs led by legendary figures like Darby Sabini, the Italian boss who controlled the London racetracks, would have crushed a provincial outfit like the Peaky Blinders without breaking a sweat. The idea that a small Birmingham gang could have successfully challenged these established powers is historically laughable. Billy Kimber's Birmingham boys did clash with the London gangs over control of the racetracks, but the original Peaky Blinders were long gone by then. They never took London. They likely never even visited, except perhaps on a day trip. Then there is the involvement of Winston Churchill. In the series, Churchill, then a government minister, is depicted as having a complex clandestine relationship with the gang's leader, using him as an unofficial agent to handle politically sensitive matters. This is perhaps the most audacious fabrication. Winston Churchill was a towering figure of 20th-century British politics. He was obsessed with national security and threats to the state. The notion that he would have outsourced a critical intelligence operation to a provincial gangster is beyond absurd. There is absolutely no record of any contact, direct or indirect, between Churchill and anyone associated with the Peaky Blinders. It is a purely fictional device used to raise the stakes of the story and lend it an air of political significance it never possessed. The real Blinders were a problem for the Birmingham police, not the British government. Similarly, the plotlines involving the Irish Republican Army, IRA, are entirely invented. The series places the gang in the middle of the violent conflict over Irish independence, dealing with stolen government weapons and navigating the treacherous world of Republican spies and British intelligence. While Birmingham, with its large Irish population, was certainly a place of interest for both sides of the conflict, there is no evidence that the Peaky Blinders were ever involved. They were criminals, not political activists. Their motivations were greed and power on a local scale, not national liberation or political ideology. To entangle them in the Irish question is to misunderstand their fundamental nature. They were thugs, not freedom fighters or counter-revolutionaries. Their concerns were for the next street, not the next state. By weaving these elements into the narrative, the television series performs a clever trick. It elevates a story about a street gang into a story about the secret history of Britain in the 20th century. It makes the Peaky Blinders seem central to the great events of their time. This is what epic storytelling does. It connects the personal story of its heroes to the grand sweep of history. But in this case, the connection is entirely artificial. The real Peaky Blinders were not protagonists in the drama of nations. They were extras in the background of their own city's history. Their story is a small one, a tale of poverty and violence in the industrial Midlands. It does not need Winston Churchill or the IRA to be compelling. The truth of their desperate, brutal lives is dramatic enough on its own, but it is a different kind of drama. It is a drama of social realism, not a gangster fantasy. The myth requires a grand stage, but the truth is found in a dirty back alley. The two can never be reconciled. The fiction gives us a flattering mirror showing us heroes larger than life. The history gives us a shard of broken glass showing us a fractured, ugly, and uncomfortable reflection of a forgotten world. And so we arrive at the final, most surreal chapter of this story. The transformation is complete. The name that once terrorized the working-class districts of Birmingham has become a global brand. The reality of the gang, the poverty, the squalor, the pathetic, brutal crimes has been entirely subsumed by a slick, romanticized, and immensely profitable myth. The journey from the horror of the slums to a fashion brand is the ultimate irony. The Peaky Blinder of today is not a person, it is an aesthetic. It is a haircut, the Peaky Blinder cut, short on the sides, longer on top. It is a style of dress, the tweed suit, the grandad shirt, the heavy boots, and of course, the ubiquitous flat cap. It is a brand of beer, a style of barbershop, a theme for weddings and corporate events. You can take a Peaky Blinders tour of Birmingham, though the places you visit have more to do with the television show's filming locations than with any actual history. This commercialization of the myth represents the final victory of fiction over fact. The story has been stripped of all its uncomfortable truths. The violence is no longer the desperate act of a starving teenager. It is a stylized, slow-motion ballet. The poverty is no longer a crushing, inescapable reality. It is a gritty, atmospheric backdrop. The gangsters are no longer pathetic, brutal thugs. They are charismatic anti-heroes, tragic figures worthy of our admiration and sympathy. We have taken a story about the social ills of industrial capitalism and turned it into a product to be consumed. It is a remarkable feat of cultural alchemy. We have managed to turn lead into gold. The base metal of a grim historical reality has been transmuted into the glittering allure of a blockbuster franchise. It is a testament to the power of storytelling and the insatiable appetite of consumer culture. Why do we do this? Why do we prefer the beautiful lie to the ugly truth? Perhaps it is because the truth is too difficult to face. The real story of the Peaky Blinders forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about class, poverty, and the social contract. It shows us a society that failed its most vulnerable members, a world where children were forced to become monsters in order to survive. This is a messy, complicated, and deeply unsettling story. It does not offer easy answers or clear-cut heroes and villains. The myth, on the other hand, is simple. It gives us good guys who do bad things for good reasons. It gives us a clear sense of right and wrong, even if those lines are blurred. It gives us a world that, for all its violence, is ultimately understandable and even aspirational. It is a fantasy of power, a story where the downtrodden rise up and take what is theirs. It is a far more comforting narrative than the reality of a dead-end street. The story of the Peaky Blinders has now come full circle. It began with a particular style of dress, a way for impoverished young men to create an identity and project power. Today, that same style is used by a new generation, not to project power, but to signal an affinity with a fictional version of that power. The flat cap is no longer a symbol of the working class or the street tough. It is a symbol of being a fan of a television show. The legacy of the Peaky Blinders is not one of crime or social change. It is a legacy of branding. They have become, in the end, little more than a logo. A cool, edgy image to be printed on t-shirts and sold around the world. The ghosts of Harry Fowles and Stephen McHickey, if they could see it, would surely not know whether to laugh or to cry. Their short, brutal lives, their petty crimes, their forgotten graves, all of it has been grist for the mill of the entertainment industry. Their pain has become our pleasure. Their tragedy has become our theme park. We have travelled all the way from the bloody cobblestones of Birmingham to the glossy covers and bars named after gangsters. History has become a commodity. But now, at the end of this journey, a choice remains. What will you carry with you? The brutal truth that forces you to think, or the beautiful legend that allows you to dream? Tell us in the comments what you choose, for in the stories we tell ourselves, we define the world we live in.